Chapter 19. Where Cloud and Mountain Meet. It was summertime in England. 24-year-old Tom Frank was working as the attendant at a small filling station just outside Great Yarmouth. A middle-aged couple who had stopped for petrol spotted two Oster aeroplanes and a small office marked Anglian Air Charters in the adjacent field. "Are there any pleasure flights for today?" they asked Tom. "Yes," he replied. When they went to book tickets, it was Tom who sold them, and when they went over to the planes, it was Tom who escorted them and helped them get strapped in. Then it was he who climbed into the pilot's seat. "What? You again?" the husband inquired, rather taken aback. "Yes, the pilot is having a day off," said Tom, "so they're letting me have a go." In spite of their qualms, they enjoyed their flight around Yarmouth. It was all in a day's work for Tom, who'd done the trip nearly 5,000 times. After a spell at Manchester University, Tom had trained as an RAF jet pilot during his 2 years' national service. He had also become a Christian. He was expected to go into the family business on leaving the Air Force, but instead chose to study at the London Bible College and aim for MAF. We required a minimum of 500 flying hours in light aircraft, so for 4 years he flew every summer at Yarmouth to build up his experience. As the owner of the charter company also owned the petrol station, Tom cheerfully took on the attendant's job as well. He said it helped break the monotony. Meanwhile at Jimmer, Bob and Betty continued to manage the flying program on their own. Betty's days were busy as she had to educate their son Bruce. Most of the time, she also had the MAF radio on, monitoring Bob's flights and receiving his position reports and landing information. She would receive flight requests and, if necessary, relay emergency calls to him in the air. The program accounts filled her spare time. MAF wives all over the world play a vital part in the operations. For Bob, too, the work was growing steadily as needs increased, and the number of places served multiplied. New airstrip sites were requested, but they couldn't be identified or cleared until he was free to trek in over land. An additional pilot was clearly required. By 1963, Tom Frank had completed his preparation for MAF service. He and a second plane were on their way to Ethiopia. Bob and Betty were due to return to the US, but waited to ensure Tom could become thoroughly familiar with the program. Alistair MacDonald came with Margaret and took over as program manager. A further British pilot family came too, Les and Elaine Brown, who'd gained MAF experience in Kenya. Hugh and Norma Beck had already arrived following the closure of the Sudan. In the Sudan, the British Embassy negotiated with the military government about our MAF houses and hangar. The governor at Malakal was willing to help, and our prayer partners prayed. Suddenly, the government agreed to buy our base properties for the army and made a fair payment. At first, the money seemed of little use because it was in Sudanese pounds in a Khartoum bank. It seemed unlikely that the Sudan Exchange Control would allow us to take it out of the country. But permission was granted. A second miracle, just when we needed the money to build a new base of our own at Jimmer. Our assets had not been lost. God had transferred them. In our 1964 December newsletter, telling of the suffering and restrictions in the Sudan, I was also able to write, "This is the day of opportunity in Ethiopia. How long this door will remain open, we do not know. It is open now, and no cost or effort must be spared to bring the good news of God's love and to show his care to many people in this land." The next 13 years were to bear this out. Tom Frank sat in a hut by the mountain airstrip at Ira, Rain poured off the corrugations on the tin roof. Beside him was an Ethiopian lying on a stretcher, his left leg heavily bandaged and supported by cushions, his eyes closed, his breathing deep and noisy. Tom had flown from Jimma that morning in response to an urgent radio request from the German missionary there. The injured man must be flown to hospital at once. The weather hadn't been too bad when Tom had left Jimma. Now the missionary looked out at the rain, then at the patient, then at Tom, who knew only too well what he was thinking. The man on the stretcher, a leader of the church at Ira, had fallen while repairing a roof. He had lost a lot of blood, was weak and in great pain. Heavy clouds shrouded the mountaintops all around, making flying impossible. Minutes went slowly by. Then Tom pointed to a distant ridge. "The cloud base is starting to lift over there. We should be able to make it now." He was still wary. He'd been in Ethiopia now for 3 years and learnt much in that time. 2 years before, he'd had an accident here at Ira, so he checked the strip with extra care, finding one soft patch he must avoid. They carried the patient out and gently fastened the stretcher to the floor of the plane. A brief prayer by the missionary committed the flight to God. Rain spattered down onto the windscreen as Tom took off, but the slipstream soon drove the water away and cleared his view. A gentle pull on the control column, and the plane was racing upwards towards the low, ragged clouds just above. He headed it towards the gap he'd seen between clouds and ridge. To enter the cloud, even for a few seconds in such a mountainous area, could prove fatal. Once through the gap, he turned the aircraft towards Jimma. Around him the rain had stopped. The cloud base was higher. He was able to gain more altitude. Over to the right, it looked as though the sun was trying to break through. But he didn't like what he saw ahead, a vast mass of dense black storm clouds with jagged streams of lightning. Beyond this lay Jimma, itself probably in the throes of a deluge, which would make landing impossible. He called the MAF base there. The storm made reception difficult, and there was a continual crackle of interference, but he could just hear Norma Beck's voice answering. "Can you give me the Jimma weather, please, Norma?" There was a pause. Norma's radio room overlooked the airstrip. "It's raining heavily here," came the reply. "The cloud base is still very low." "Roger, Norma. The weather ahead of me looks bad. I'll try and skirt around it to the east and find a break to get me through to Jimma. I have an urgent medical evacuation case on board. Please make sure there's a vehicle ready at the airfield." Tom looked at the ground below, then at his map. He made a pencil mark on it and turned the plane towards some clearer weather just to the north of the stormy area, noting the time in his flight log. He set the line of his compass against the new direction. It was 30 degrees off track and would take him over some particularly wild, mountainous country. It wasn't one of his usual routes, and he didn't know the terrain below. He concentrated carefully on his map, trying to make sure he knew his exact position. Half an hour later, he was still heading in the same direction. Jimma was now well to his right, but still the angry mass of black storm cloud hung low in that direction. He radioed his position to Norma and again asked for the latest Jimma weather. "Still no change, I'm afraid, Tom. I'll let you know as soon as I can see any improvement." Another half hour. He noticed a slight improvement in the direction of Jimma. The inky blackness of the clouds had given way to a sombre grey, which seemed to fuse into the ground below as the rain reduced visibility to little more than a mile. The important thing was to know exactly what lay beyond. Again Tom sent his position report. Again the reply came back. No change. He made some quick calculations. His fuel was running low, and unless he could head for Jimma in the next 10 minutes, He wouldn't have enough to reach his nearest alternative strip. Still, no word from Norma. He picked up the microphone. "Any change in the weather yet?" There was a pause again. Norma knew this was a critical stage. "I'm afraid there is still no improvement, Tom." His heart sank. The patient had been lying peacefully dozing on his stretcher, but now he had awakened and looked up pitifully at Tom, obviously in great pain. Tom glanced at the clock on the instrument panel. The decision point had come. The weather in the direction of Jimmer had improved a little, but if the weather at the airport was still closed, it would be a risk. Such risks were never justified, even by the critical condition of his passenger. Tom turned the plane towards the clear weather, away from Jimmer and towards his alternative airstrip, a wild, desolate place among the mountains, some 20 minutes flying time away. Just at that moment, Norma's voice came through his earphones. "The cloud is lifting clear of the hills in your direction, Tom." "Thanks, Norma. Just what I needed to hear." He banked the plane and quickly turned to the heading for Jimmer. Soon the rain was beating loudly on the windscreen, and the swirling rain clouds scudded backwards only just above the cockpit. It grew quite dark inside the plane as it lurched and shuddered in the turbulent air left by the passing thunderstorm. Ahead, the outline of the mountains showed faintly through the murky greyness. Yes, it was safe to proceed. A few minutes later, the plane touched down on the wet runway at Jimmer. Hugh Beck ran out and, sheltering under its wing, waited for Tom to join him. They quickly pushed the plane backwards into the hangar. Tom unfastened the harness holding down the sick man's stretcher. Hugh backed the MAF Land Rover as close as he could to the door of the plane, and they drove the patient to the hospital. Some weeks later, well on the way to recovery, the man was flown back to Ira. In one hectic week of flying, Tom carried out 45 flights, often in similar rainy conditions. He summed up the experience in a letter to us. "It's quite sobering to look back on the week and reflect how many missionaries have come to depend on us, sitting on the ground waiting for rain to stop. I thought of what the delays would mean and the large number of people who'd be affected. One station could be without urgent groceries, another without essential building materials. 2 vital planning meetings could have lacked key members and been unable to reach decisions. In 2 different places, patients were waiting for flights to hospital. The ramifications were endless. It's wonderful to know that the same God who has given us this job is in control of all the circumstances affecting it. I am slowly learning to become panic-proof." The whole matter of safety and margins is of vital importance for any aviation operation. Very often, it's essential to decide whether it's safe to fly on or necessary to turn back. In Ethiopia, where cloud and mountain meet, we could not forever be turning back. We had to learn when we could get through. There were many types of airstrips. There were strips that had curves and bends, strips that sloped sideways as well as up and down, strips producing optical illusions, mountainside strips with dangerous wind turbulence, strips that precipitated you into the air over vast gorges where the ground dropped away with awesome abruptness. There were strips perched on high ridges which would frighten the ordinary pilot, and sometimes did when we carried visiting flyers, strips that were hard to recognize as airstrips at all. All these were our pilot's daily lot. Landing after landing had to be carried out on them, and judgment after judgment made about them. In many areas, there could be up to 14 landings during only a few hours of flying, with off and on loading of passengers or freight in between. But it was well worthwhile. Though the flights across high mountains and deep valleys were often very short, they saved many miles and hours, even days, of slow, difficult, dangerous, and expensive land travel. MAF pilots are not endowed with superhuman skills and endurance. They are ordinary people. They have simply felt the call of God to MAF and have worked hard, sometimes through long years of training, to gain their professional licenses. Then they have painstakingly built up the skills necessary for bush and mountain flying. After joining MAF and arriving at their stations, they've been carefully taught to use each difficult landing strip, made familiar with each route. Both they and the planes they use are specifically prepared against accident. Our planes are equipped to enhance their safety. Oversized wheels with modified tire tread, an alternate fuel system for the engine in case of failure in the standard one, full military seat harness, not only for the pilot but for every passenger, special navigational devices. Each new area we had entered had taught us new things and challenged us in new ways. There were other countries now calling for our services. What new lessons and opportunities awaited us?